Thank you so much, Felicitas, for this beautiful introduction. Thanks, everybody, for inviting me here. I mean, it's a great pleasure and it's an honor to be here and to talk to you guys and to listen to your presentations as well. And thanks to the audience. I mean, this is the very last presentation at this conference, and I'm really glad that I see so many faces here. I mean, it's just brilliant. So I would like to apologize because my slides look extremely ugly, and I have a good reason for that. Because when I realized that my presentation was the last presentation at this conference, I decided to make it like participatory, meaning that I was trying to weave into my presentations various themes and various issues that we've been talking about. So I was trying to address some of the questions that we talked today on the boat. I was trying to address some of the questions that we talked about yesterday. And of course, I kind of managed to do it while other people were presenting, and I was quickly preparing my slides. But this resulted in a very, very ugly presentation. To make up for the presentation, here, as Felicitas said, I edit the Post-Digital Science and Education Journal and Book Series. Here are two examples of print journal, and here are two examples of books. Take a look, and please don't give them back because I just don't feel like carrying them back to Croatia. So whoever is interested, just take them home. But first, allow everybody to check them, and then just take what you feel like. So maybe you should just send them around. Okay, so my presentation will be structured in three kind of parts. The first part is post-digital science and education. Originally, I was not planning to talk about this thing, but since there was so much discussion about what the post-digital is and definitions and so on during this conference, I felt the need to talk about this just for a wee bit. Then it's bioinformational philosophy and post-digital knowledge ecologies. So I will be introducing the biodigital turn in post-digital thinking because I think it's really important to address this. It's one of the newest, I mean, it's not really new, but it's kind of has become very prominent very recently. I'll be talking about it later. And then finally, I'm just briefly present about social participation in and for post-digital age, which is basically a very, very short summary of a chapter that I wrote for the book edited by Felicitas and Andreas. So thanks for pushing me to write this, both of you guys. And I think this has not been published yet, so this is new material that I'm presenting. So we all know, I mean, everybody was talking about these original sources of inspiration for post-digital theory. This is Nicholas Negroponte, 1998, Dustin Hoffman. When I see this one, I always remember the song Mrs. Robinson. And like, it's something that it has been really, really influential in my thinking. But then there's Kim Kaskone, of course, with his 2000 article, which actually introduces the word post-digital. Interestingly, I saw across presentations in those past 2 days, I saw sometimes people write post-digital with a dash, and sometimes people write it without a dash. In the journal, in the book series, and everywhere, it was, I mean, the editorial team decided to go for only one standard, so wherever in post-digital science and education publishing ecosystem, you will always find the word post-digital without the dash, because I think it kind of sounds more natural. But yeah, I can see that people are still using both standards. Here are some screenshots that I use in my introductory presentations about post-digital science and education. I think that you are probably aware of most of these things. But what I would like to add, and that's something that I think has kind of remained unnoticed, although we are here in Germany now talking about the post-digital in the post-digital center. And this is that unlike many other concepts that have been developed quite recently in the social sciences and the humanities, that the concept of the post-digital is actually primarily the brainchild of continental Europe. So it's not primarily an Anglo-Saxon concept, it's primarily a concept that actually originated within places like the Netherlands, Germany, and so on, a bit of the UK as well. Can you still be called Europe, James? Anyway, so Okay, let's move on. A bit of Australia as well, but these are just some early examples, and apart from those nitpicking things such as dashes and place of origin, what I actually want to show you here is that this is all before 2014. This is now we are in year 2014, and we are speaking now here, we are speaking about post-digital research, but again, we are speaking about post-digital research in the context of arts. Roughly in 2018, we have the emergence of some post-digital centers. One is obviously the Center for Post-Digital Cultures in Coventry. This is an old screenshot, which I'm not updating because, I mean, the page doesn't exist anymore, but I took the screenshot back in 2018. This is something that some of you may recognize. But basically, so there are a few post-digital centers around the world. And then, practically in the same year, in 2018, I wrote with those people, with Jeremy, Tina, Thomas, Juha, and Sarah. The six of us wrote this paper called Post-Digital Science and Education, in which what we really did, well, at least to our thinking, was we took a concept which primarily originated in the arts, music, visual arts, and we kind of stole the concept and appropriated the concept for the humanities and social sciences. And of course, this is not unusual at all. I mean, when I'm speaking about it, if you speak about the concept such as postmodernism, accelerationism, futurism, all these things have originated in the arts and then have moved to the humanities and the social sciences. So we are thieves, but we are not the first ones to do this. And I think it's important to realize that actually, while the concept of the post-digital does now exist for almost a quarter of a century, actually the majority of the concept has remained, I mean, the majority of this time was spent in development in the context of the arts. It's actually only for the past 4 or 5 years that the concept has been taken seriously in the humanities and the social sciences. So it's very much a new thing. It's very much a thing in flux. Okay, so what we did in 2018, we also founded this journal, Post-Digital Science and Education. There's the book series, you've got the books, and there's the encyclopedia. This is just a project screenshot from my website because Springer has been taking their sweet time to set up the website. 40 entries are already ready for production. I'm hoping that the website will be up and running in a few weeks. Unfortunately, it's not up yet, so this is what I can show you. So what we did here, this community, we created a publishing ecosystem for post-digital science and education, consisting, as I said, of the journal, book series, and the encyclopedia, which kind of covers all the major things. So in the journal, we will publish most recent cutting-edge stuff. In the book series, you will also publish cutting edge, but it will be like dedicated collections. It will be something like 200, 300, 400 pages collections. And of course, the encyclopedia is then for solidifying knowledge, for looking back, and for kind of, settling things down. So, okay, now let's go to theory. Some early considerations. You will see that I'm very carefully avoiding the word definition, is Andrew Feinberg, one of the most influential critical philosophers of technologies today, says that, for instance, for him, the terms digital and post-digital seem artificial because the post-digital preceded the digital, should be called the pre-digital, and so on. We've heard today and yesterday by people about, somebody will raise their hand and say, look, I have a problem with the post. Of course, Andrew Feinberg has a problem with the post as well. And not just him. I mean, Paul Evanson says that he does not disagree that we are in a post-digital age, but he disagrees that we are entering it now. Peter McLaren does his typical thing about social justice and critical pedagogy. Tim Fons, this is quite, this sentence has been cited a few times during the past 2 days, says what he says, and Christine and Sarah speak about the importance of bringing of language and so on. I mean, all these things I'll just continue and then I'll show you why I'm showing you this. So Michael Peters and Tina Besley call for critical philosophy of the post-digital. They're speaking about process philosophy. They're speaking about Whitehead and so on. Dave Cormier and others speak, of course, that we need to give less attention to novelty and so on. And Florian Kramer, who, by the way, wrote a paper which is still the most cited post-digital paper, he wrote it in 2015, said that the post should be understood, not understood as postmodernism, but should be understood as post-punk, and so on, and so on, and so on. So, when we started our journal and when we wrote this paper that was aimed to be kind of a foundational paper, and indeed it did end up in this way, we wrote that the post-digital is hard to define, messy and predictable, technological and non-technological, and biological and informational. And actually this was, I can't remember who added this part of the sentence, because we literally wrote collectively, and I'm not sure, maybe it was Jeremy, maybe it was Sarah, maybe it was myself, no idea. But the thing is that, excuse me, what we added here was, I think, very important, and I will, in a minute, I will show why. As we all know, in early 2020, we had the pandemic. It was a huge pandemic, and of course, it made turmoil in the world of educational technology. The thing is that people suddenly ended up working from their homes. Pupils and students started learning from their homes. And what we had here really was, well, it was also something else. We had the impact of a biological virus, so we had a biological threat that kept us at home. So it was not about the threat like a bullet, like a physical threat. It was a biological threat. It was an invisible virus. So when you would go in those first days, when you would go to the supermarket, you know, dressed up like an alien in all those plastic gloves and everything, you would always feel uncomfortable because you would never know, you know, where the danger comes from, right? Of course, now we can laugh at it, having taken 4 jabs or whatever. But originally, I mean, it was not really a laughing matter, right? So what happened is that as we did all those things, as we did all those definitions, you could see that there is a bit of biology somewhere here implicitly, but not really explicitly. And suddenly with the pandemic, we have an explicit reference to biology. Suddenly biology has become much more important. Today, biology has become much more important than it has become yesterday. And of course, now I was interested in this, and actually there is the whole field of biopolitics and bioinformation and so on, from Michel Foucault to I don't know whom. I mean, there is a history of this type of inquiry, but I will be completely open and I will say that I never considered this history very serious, especially because I was trained as a physicist. And the post-digital science and education community also really hasn't gone very deep into the direction of biology before the pandemic. And suddenly the pandemic changed things. We all refocused to biology. And so I did a bit of research with Michael Peters and Sarah Hayes, but it was actually Michael's idea. And we found a few things. I mean, you will find a few quotes here. Interestingly enough, somewhere at the end of 20th century, the beginning of 21st century, like 1998, 1999, the budgets for biology have for the first time surpassed research budgets for physics. You know, 20th century, Cold War, space race, whatever, all the money was in physics and only very little money in biology. But cloning of Dolly the sheep, mapping the genome, and so on, and so on, and so on, and suddenly research budgets for biology have become bigger than research budgets for physics. And they have remained bigger since, and the gap is widening. So biology gets more and more, and physics gets less and less. And second, actually what happened was that, and this is from Craig Venter, that now it's a bit longer story, but I think it's important. If you take a look at the history of digital technologies, what we did at the end of 20th century, you know, started from maybe from the 80s, we digitized things. So we digitized all the books, and we have Google Books. We digitized pretty much all music. We had Spotify. I remember when I was in high school, which was not so long time ago, hopefully, you know, I had cassettes, I had CDs and so on, records. Now everything is in the cloud, now everything is online, because all the music, pretty much all the music has been digitized, pretty much all the books have been digitized. So it kind of culminated with the mapping of genome. What we basically did, we took a biological thing, genome, literally piece of human being, and we translated it into code. We translated it into zeros and ones. But of course, once we digitized everything, because human beings are never happy, we started to look back and we said, okay, so how do we bring back code into biology? And the whole bioresearch, bioinformational research for the past, well, much longer than 20 years, but especially during the past 20 years, is about moving back, is about moving from the informational world into the biological world. And artificial intelligences, ChatGPT, and so on, that's the typical example of that, right? So you've got the situation where you are taking a digital system and you are trying to teach the digital system to think like a biological entity, like a human being. So you are basically going back. So if we spent the first half of the information revolution digitizing the analog, now we entered the second half of the information revolution where we are analogizing the digital. I think it's a hugely important change in direction. So what we did, as I said, with all those people, with Michael, with Sarah, with Derek, I edited co-edited two books with these people about this. So we were interested in, okay, so let's see what happens. Let's see how this works. So what we argued is that the 20th century focus on machinery needs to be replaced, at least partially, by a focus on a better understanding of living systems and so on and so on. Basically, what we wanted to do is that we wanted to focus on this blurry, messy, and other whatever relationships between biology and information. And interestingly, still at this conference, within those 2 days, people will focus to things such as human relationships, of course with computers. I mean, there's the whole point of post-digital thinking. But, you know, digital spaces, analog spaces, digital this, analog that, how things digital and how things analog work together. But there's not a lot of mention of biology. And this is why I wanted to stress biology, because I think that, well, I was invited to give a keynote, and I thought that it would be nice to widen the discourse a bit and offer some new idea that perhaps hasn't been mentioned so much within the conference. So what we have here is really the great convergence, as it is called in literature. So, and this is the vision, like in the coming years, like biodigital technologies will be woven in our lives in the same way the digital technologies are now. And of course, this may change the way that we understand ourselves. So it kind of changes many, many things, including human nature. And these things are already happening. I mean, it's not something. You probably remember the vaccination debate, the COVID vaccination debate. There are some other things as well. You know, like we had this discussion of trans woman who used to be a man but now is a woman and competes at the Female Olympics. And now there's a problem because other women see there's unfair competition and so on. So this is the biodigital thing, right? Did I make myself clear what I think by biodigital? Okay, I'll do it in the next slide. So Craig Venter in 2012 said this is the practice of the great convergence, so that we can digitize life and we can generate life from digital code literally. So before, if you wanted to take if you wanted to send a biological sample, you need to pack it into somewhere, probably refrigerate it, and send through DHL or something like that. But today, what you do for simple things, you can actually send the code, somebody connects the code to a box, and this box produces a live protein. I mean, this technology exists. This technology exists for 10 years, probably for even more years, but we know it for that. Okay, so before I go to these 3 points, I will just briefly explain what I mean by the biodigital. So physics used to be the science of tinkering. Physics used to be the science of making things. Biology, up to very recently, used to be the science of classification. So this is this plant, this is this plant, this is this animal, this is that animal. Biologists of up to mid-20th century really didn't have much opportunity to actively tinker with things. Of course, they could grow different types of cabbage, or they could grow different types of species of dogs. That's why we have small dogs and big dogs, because some genetic engineering was possible, but on a very a primitive level compared to today. What the computers have enabled us to do, they've enabled us to literally pick genes and create new things from old genes. They have enabled us to actively tinker with living systems here and now. So when I say bioinformation, I say it's hugely important, because bioinformation is biology which cannot be done without the help of computers. And the other way around, computers here are hopeless if they don't have the biological component. But when you take those two components together, you get bioinformation, which is a very powerful tool, and it's not just about epistemology, it's not just about thinking, it's not just about this and that. It's about very practical applications. But okay, let me go back to philosophy. So there are like three main implications of this. The first one is that the full physical integration of these things means that digital technology can be embedded into organisms, biological components can exist as parts of digital technologies, and so on. So this is one of the important things. We can create hybrid lives of forms of life and technology. I mean, my father is already a hybrid form of life and technology with his pacemaker, but here I'm thinking about like deeper, right? Okay, coevolution happens when advances in one field or one domain generate major advances in another. So now we really have complementary systems, biological and informational, so that we cannot understand them just using informational tools or epistemologies or just using biological ones. What we need is an integration. We need a deep philosophical integration. And this is what the third point speaks about. The conceptual convergence is a form that could shape our framing and approach to biological and digital realms, and of course reconfigure what we mean by human being, what we mean by technology, what we mean by this, what we mean by that. Now, I'll go back. Now, this is something that I would like to just stop and think about for the moment, because this is not happening yet. Actually, it is happening, but it hasn't become mainstream yet. What happens, however, is that those things are cooking somewhere, and they're very hard to recognize. And one of the reasons why they are very hard to recognize is that because a huge amount of bioinformational research, unlike computer science research, for instance, does not happen in public institutions, does not happen openly. Pharmaceutical industry and so on, there are so many private labs working so many things, not publishing papers that we don't know about because those things are copyrighted, those things are patented with the idea to sell. I mean, big pharma is one of the biggest industries in the world. So, but for instance, when we had the COVID and when things got opened, so what happened? Somebody sequenced, I think it was the Chinese, sequenced the genome of the COVID, released it out in the open. Everybody could download it. People took it. A few months after, you had 10 different vaccines developed in 10 different parts of the world. This is the typical power of bioinformation. It used to be that people would, I mean, vaccines and medicines used to be developed for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Now we literally had many vaccines developed within less than 6 months. Of course, some of them were more efficient, some of them were less efficient, and so on. But the idea is that bioinformation is so hugely powerful in these terms, in practical terms of developing stuff. Okay, so how does this all finally, after 20, how many minutes? How does this all apply to social participation? Well, social participation, whatever social inclusion is, I took almost randomly one definition. It could be many others. But the thing is that what we have we have that participation has personal, individual, institutional, social, and global dimensions. So it has all those types of dimensions. And I think that in all those transformations, we can agree that participation always depends on communication. Because if we don't communicate, we don't participate. If we communicate, we are at least at the beginning of participation. Now, when I communicate, what I say here, unless I'm very drunk, which I'm not, is pretty much controlled by me. So I control what I'm saying. I control what I write. I control what I do online. But what happens when I take a blood sample and I give you the blood sample for analysis? I also communicated something about myself, something very deep, whether I have the COVID, whether I have a genetic predisposition for cancer, whether I have this, whether I have that. Imagine uses of these things from insurance companies to migration policies and whatnot, right? So it's a big deal. It's a serious deal, right? You send out a piece of very personal information, but you have no control under information that you are transmitting. It's very different from just informational thing when I'm speaking and when I have control over things that I'm talking about. So this is a hugely important difference. There are many differences, but I singled out this one because I think it's hugely important. Now, Catherine Page Harden wrote this book, The Genetic Lottery, and she said that, I mean, the book is quite contested. I just recently published a review of the book by Michael Jopling in Postdigital Science and Education, and Michael is quite critical of the book. But she does say one very important thing, is that human destiny or whatever consists of two very different lotteries. So one part is the natural lottery, meaning what you inherited, the genetic material that you inherited from your parents, how tall you will be, whether you will be slim or fat, whether you will be genetically predisposed for this sickness or for that sickness, and so on. So your genotype. And then the second one is also the social class of your family. We have sociology, we have whole fields talking about how your family, upbringing, income, whatsoever, determines your success in school, your success in life and whatever. But basically there are two lotteries. One of the lotteries is the genetic lottery, and the other lottery is this social lottery. The combination of these two lotteries actually makes somebody what we all are today. Okay, so of course the idea, can somebody help me? The idea of genetic lottery is closely linked to eugenics, right? And we all know 20th century eugenics. I don't think I need to talk about it very much. There were many terrible examples in all parts of the world, from Germany to the US, pretty much everywhere we had the situation in which somebody tried to use this genetic lottery for various vicious purposes. But the political project in participation or in emancipation is therefore not just about social things. It's not just about alleviating things that are such as parents' income, level of schooling, and so on and so on and so on. The political project of the project of bioinformational participation is equally about creating policies, creating systems which would kind of alleviate the outcomes of this genetic lottery. And now there are a few citations which actually speak to this. One is from Ben Williamson, which is in the context of education. The other one is from Rose. The idea is that we need to literally take all those things into account as we deal with participation. So it's not, if we are really post-digital, then we should not just care about social aspects of participation. We must take care also about biological aspects of participation. And when I say biological, I mean much, much, much beyond the usual suspects, such as gender, for instance. Okay, so now we have the infopolitics, biopolitics continuum. So the idea that we have infopolitics, I think that I don't need to introduce infopolitics very much, but it would be things oriented to things such as fake news, post-truth, the things that we've been talking about today. Things oriented towards, information literacy, critical media literacy, digital literacy, post-digital literacy, many things that people have been talking about at the conference. But and of course, if you take James's, who already left, favorite social materialism, infopolitics introduces new classes of actors such as algorithms and so on and so on. But biopolitics also introduces its own set of challenges, also introduces its new class of actors, such as post-digital humans, and so on. And now, the infopolitical actors and the biopolitical actors obviously have a different material base, because an algorithm is based on silicon and electricity. I'm based on flesh and blood. Now, the combination of this are some new bioinformational actors, which we don't exactly know who these are, but it's about the post-digital convergence between those various actors. So even methods such as actor network theory and so on need to be expanded in this direction as well, because it's hugely important. It's just a different class of actors as well. And I wrote this chapter. I mean, it's going to be out in this book. I'm sure that many of you will have the opportunity to read it. There is a long line of explanations how I came to these conclusions. But what I would like to present here is the typical 5 W's used in journalism. I would just like to skip to my conclusions, give 5 slides about conclusions, and then quickly wrap up. So, who participates in biodigital, post-digital participation? Well, this type of participation involves a wide range of factors. Some of them are human, some of them are non-human, some of them are combined, some of them are semi-human. So definitely we should not just talk about participation of human beings. We can talk about participation of human beings if we change the definition of human being, right? But the idea is that we need to take into account actors based on carbon, silicon, possibly other materials, and so on. We don't need to subscribe to radical equality between them. We don't need to say that an opinion formed by an algorithm is the same like your opinion, because it's not. But what we do need to understand is that they are all important in their own ways, and that we need to negotiate their existence and their agency in some way. So what needs to be done, or what is to be done, to paraphrase one nice, very old and very famous paper? Well, we need to analyze those transformations. Of course, we need to follow the money. We need to see who profits, because in those bioinformational world, it's hugely important to use a lot of critical theory and to see actually the flow of money, who profits from what. When, of course, not in the way that conspiracy theorists will tell you about the vaccinations, but on a much deeper level. We need to create new areas of inquiry, and here I'm again mentioning Ben Williamson, who does it in the field of education, but I think that we should do it much wider. And of course, we need new communities of inquiry. So when we speak about community, now the community should not be just people, maybe. Maybe it's something else. Okay? So this knowledge should translate, of course, into policy practice, and this is one of the challenges. We now have, for instance, a few years ago, philosophers could finally get work. How did it happen? Self-driving cars whatsoever. European legislation is developing. Suddenly, ethics has become important. Ethics has entered the European Parliament. My friend Mark Koekelberg from the University of Vienna now actually advertises a few PhD positions in ethics of AI. As I said, I mean, AI has done beautiful things. One of the things it has done is that it has provided some employment for PhDs in philosophy. Okay, but we need to also develop new visions, new ideas, and so on. I think that critical pedagogy, Frere and ideas about, hopeful futures, about visions and so on. I'm not going to talk about it deeper, but I think that at least some of you know what I'm talking about, that we need to go these directions. It's not just enough to move on with business as usual, because bioinformation fundamentally changes the way that we think, the way that we act, and of course the way that we should react. Now when? The question of when. Why am I asking the question of when? Well, because it's in 5 Ws, but also because, you could say, well, but it's not so relevant yet because, those technologies are not there yet. We are not talking about them right now. I mean, there's still the time for that. Yes, I agree. But if we leave development of this into the hands of, in the hands of private capital, especially the big pharma, then we are all doomed. The idea is that the only way that we could influence development of these things into a good direction is to start yesterday, really, not even today, to start as soon as possible. I think that the humanities, social sciences, and especially education need to be involved in co-development of this from the very beginning. This is a historical chance because those things are not mainstream yet. They are slowly getting mainstream, as you could see from funding. It's now been more than 2 decades that bioinformation actually gets more money than physics. So it will eventually get there. But it will eventually get there with or without us. But the question is how it will end up. Because technology is not destiny, right? As Andrew Finn would say, depending on ways how you develop technology, this technology will have those affordances. So in order to shape these technologies on time, we should start today. Where? That's an interesting one. Again, for all those scholars of places, spaces, and so on, because the pre-digital struggles for power and meaning have taken places in schools, universities, schools, picket lines, riots, whatever. But now, the site of struggle has changed into human body. Not just human body, body of plants, body of animals, and so on, but it has changed. The site of struggle is now, I am the site of struggle as well. So it's important to recognize this, that the sites of struggle have expanded much beyond traditional sites of struggle. Why? I don't think I need to explain this, but again, social participation needs to be re-examined because simply those changes are so fundamental and so different that in order to achieve proper or whatever adequate participation, we just need to take those things into account. Now, human-technology relationships are always changing. This is everybody's concern, and so on. So it's hugely important. I think that social participation here, and especially its educational aspects, which is why I really am so happy to be here and to talk to all these wonderful people working in the field. I think it's crucial for the development of this. And I'm not talking just about development of educational strategies, how to deal with this. Because when we as educators deal with fake news, what we do, we actually deal with consequences. Now, if we as educators have a say in development of technologies, then maybe the case of fake news could have been even avoided in the first place by putting some standards, whatever, in place. So this is what I'm saying. This needs to be done because we can literally influence the development of this technology for the better. This was my last recommendation. Now I'm going to give a couple of minutes of conclusion and let's call it a day. In the first part of the presentation, I talked about post-digital science and education. And reflecting at our discussion yesterday, I think that you will now recognize why I was so against definitions. Because in 2018-19, when all those wonderful people, including Andrew Finberg and all those big shots, have written about the post-digital, they all focus pretty much to me and my screen, me and my phone, me and my whatever this is. Okay? So they focused on this. But the pandemic shifted us towards something else. Tomorrow, something else might shift us again elsewhere. This is why the definition or the description of the concept of the post-digital needs to remain open. Because if it doesn't remain open, it will not be able to accept the first next change. The idea is to keep the concept open if not forever, then pretty much for quite a long time, in order to be able to recognize such shifts, to recognize them early enough, and to be able to react on things such as bioinformation, the challenge of bioinformation on time. The second one is bioinformation. What I presented you today is a lot of visions, some practical examples, and a lot of chit-chat, like, somebody is creating proteins from the box, somebody else is creating this, somebody else is creating that. I mean, not something that you would, this is still the city of Volkswagen, right? We are still talking about oil and steel. So we are still not in the bioinformational age in a full sense. But this technology is developing. This technology will probably develop. It may not develop. It may never become mainstream. But what if it does become mainstream and we don't have a say in its development? This is why I think that we need to have a say in its development, and this is why I think it's hugely important to focus on this. Having said that, I don't think that we should do just that. I think that the work, pupils versus screens and so on, is still very useful, that this post-digital paradigm, which focuses to digital and analog, is still very useful and so on. But I also think that we should complement this work. So I'm not saying that this work that has been, for instance, about participation that has been presented at this conference, I think it's great. I think it's hugely important. But I think that it needs to be supplemented with something like this. I would be very happy to come here in a few years' time and see that 25 presentations and 4 or 5 are about bioinformation, because it would mean that things took off. It would mean that somebody else has accepted it and that things took off. So I think it's hugely important to do that. And the third thing, social participation. Social participation is, of course, hugely important. It's hugely important for many reasons, educational participation and so on. But when we talk about participation, we should always remember that education is dialectically intertwined or whatever with research. And this means that we cannot talk just about schools. When we talk about knowledge transfer, we also need to talk about knowledge development. When we think about knowledge development, we need to think about fundamental sciences. And when we think of some natural sciences, which today include bioinformation. And we think about natural, so it's not, we should not be reactive. We should not say, okay, crap, something happened and now we need to fix our curricula in order to address the new challenge. Ideally, we should make an input. And it's really funny because this building is the Institute of Engineering, Physics, and whatever, right? So that we are, is it not? Architecture, okay, sorry. But it's important that we are talking about this in a very cross, whatever, disciplinary way. Because when we do this, then we really have a chance not just to focus on participation of people who are excluded for any reason, pupils who are excluded for any reason, and so on, but to fundamentally impact on research, policy, and practice of bioinformational participation, which I believe will be hugely important tomorrow. Thank you very much.